Well, I'll tell you what, after Kelsey's introduction of that song and the statement she made, it's not what we hope for, it's what we hope toward. I've already been blessed. But I'm going to preach anyway to your disappointment. Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. We're starting this brand new series, Upside Down, as we talk to you about the fact that as a community, as a group of believers, of followers of Jesus, which make up Hope Church, our heartbeat is to have an impact in changing the world. We can't change the world on our own, but we can actively be a part of what God is doing through His global church, and we can have a part in changing the world. There is so much happening right now that it absolutely astounds me. To think that right now, today, there are 8 other Hope Church locations that are gathering together to sing and worship Jesus, to pray for the people in their family, and to preach and to teach God's word. That is amazing. The fact that right now in other states there are multiple opportunities for our family to continue to grow, even conversations that I've had this week, it absolutely amazes me that God is working in the way that He is. But if we're not careful, we can lose sight of the fact that we are being used by God, and that we should long and desire to be used by God even in a greater way. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, turning the world upside down. In Matthew chapter 22, there were 2 religious groups who questioned Jesus. They didn't question Jesus because they wanted to learn from Jesus. That was not their objective. And they didn't question Him because they wanted someone else to hear His answer and learn from Him. Their only motivation for questioning Jesus was the hope that He would give an incorrect answer, which would lead to them having an opportunity to discredit Him, which would lead to them having an opportunity to accuse Him of blasphemy. That's what they were after. That's what they wanted. As a matter of fact, they wanted nothing more than to destroy the character of the man, Jesus Christ, and they wanted to silence His message. That's what was happening in Matthew chapter 22. Now, there's some who would say that it's very possible that this interaction with Jesus was a positive interaction, and we should assume the best. There are writers who say just that. But I think when we take all of the verses, which I did this week and which I don't have time to do for you today because I love you that much, when you compile all of those verses together, it's obvious that these 2 religious groups, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, had nefarious motives from the very beginning with regard to the person Jesus Christ and His ministry. They were sinister. They were malicious. I think we see that culminate in the fact that it was ultimately those religious leaders who started the chant, "Crucify Him." And so I don't assume that this was a positive interaction. I believe it was like all of their other interactions with Jesus. I believe there were motives, and I believe when we even look at this occasion in other Gospels, we see that to be true. Now, one of the groups who approached Jesus first, they were the Sadducees. And I just want you to know it takes everything in me, both as a pastor and as a dad who's now reached the age of actually appreciating dad jokes. It's really hard not to tell that corny joke about the Sadducees. I wouldn't say it, but there have been some who've said that they didn't believe in the resurrection and that's why they were sad, you see. But I won't tell that joke. I'm not even going to do it. But they were the first group to approach Jesus. The Sadducees was a group made up of very wealthy, powerful men from very wealthy, powerful families. They had been influenced by Hellenism. They had been influenced by Roman philosophy. And they only adhered to the written law. What you and I would know as the Old Testament laws. If it wasn't written, then their testimony would be that they wouldn't hold that in high regard, that they wouldn't submit to that. The Jewish people, they knew who this group was, and they knew what they believed. Now, one of their primary beliefs that I mentioned just a moment ago that set them in opposition to Jesus was the fact that they didn't believe Jesus' teaching on the resurrection. They must have believed that challenging him on the basis of the resurrection represented their greatest opportunity to cause him to stumble. Because when they had Jesus' attention, that was their line of attack. And so they used the written law of Moses as a launching pad, but they misused the law of Moses. That's what legalists do. They always misrepresent what God has said. As a matter of fact, I put out on social media this week, always beware of any man who misuses what God has said to manipulate you into believing what he's saying. Did everybody get that? And so they used the law as a launching pad, but they misused it, and they stretched hyperbole to the point of outlandish. And they asked Jesus a question that if one woman became the widow and wife of 7 different brothers, and then she died after the resurrection, whose wife would she be? I was just amazed that Liz Taylor was alive back then, but that's the joke that they made. It was ridiculous. What if this woman marries a brother, they have no children, he dies, and so according to the law, she becomes the wife of the next brother, and then the next brother, and then the next brother. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Jesus' answer, there will be no marriage relationships in heaven. And I always love the visible response that you get when you read that verse, because some people are like, yes. And then you see other people, they're disappointed. You always know who's happy and who's not. There'll be no marriage in heaven. I can't wait to get there. But Jesus said there'll be no marrying, no giving in marriage. And instead of his answer giving them the leverage they were hoping for to be able to attack him, it actually silenced the crowd. And the Bible says the people were astonished. And the Sadducees' failure motivated the Pharisees to get involved. So the Sadducees failed. So picture this. There would have been people there. They would have been out in the open. One group would have been challenging Jesus. It likely would have been a loud conversation while other people looked on to see how that interaction was going to go. And then when they failed, the Pharisees are going to step in because they see and witness their failure. And so the first part of verse 34 says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together." I imagine Jesus' answer didn't go over well for the Sadducees. I imagine they were pretty disgruntled after Jesus gave them an answer. But no one had an adequate response. So picture this. Jesus responds in the way that he did, and then they're kind of astonished. They all huddle up and they start to argue among themselves about who is going to challenge what Jesus has said, and there's no one who has an adequate response. They were silenced. And their unsuccessful attempt likely infuriated the Pharisees to the point that they were going to challenge Jesus, and they were going to ask Jesus a question. Now, the Pharisees, like the Sadducees, were extremely religious, and second of all, opposed to Jesus. So everybody get that? Extremely religious and opposed to Jesus. But unlike the Sadducees, they weren't always rich and powerful and from aristocratic or powerful families. Also, unlike the Sadducees, the Pharisees didn't adhere only to the written law of the Old Testament, but they also had a book that they held equal to the law of God, and the book was called Mishnah. And it was just a written collection of oral traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation, which meant they had more rules and regulations than anybody else. They had rules and regulations to the extreme. But the thing that brought them together, while they were different, as a matter of fact, there's some who suggest that the Pharisees likely hated the Sadducees, but the one thing they could agree on was wanting to see the end of the ministry of Jesus. Jesus was taking their audiences and people were following him, and they wanted to see an end to the ministry of Jesus. They wanted to be able to impose their rules and their regulations on the people. And so their disagreement didn't keep them from uniting around the common cause of silencing the man Jesus. So in Matthew chapter 22, verse 34 through verse 40, maybe starting at 35, so just follow along. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. And let me just say a word about this word test. It can mean to test in a negative, sinister sense. It can also mean to test in a way that you're seeking after information. I believe in this context, again, that they were sinister. He says to Jesus, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all of the law and the prophets." It seems a little insulting to me that this Pharisee lawyer addressed Jesus as teacher. It bothers me because they didn't want to learn anything from Jesus. They had no regard for Jesus whatsoever. As a matter of fact, they looked on the crucifixion with gladness. And to refer to him as teacher as if they wanted to learn something from him, I think it's a little insulting. They were unwilling to be taught anything by him, with the exception of those who turned to Jesus. And it's amazing how Jesus gives a simple, straightforward answer to their complex question. What is the greatest commandment in the law? Now, let me just point out that this wasn't a new question. Those religious groups had been discussing and talking the law for centuries. This would have been a common conversation for them, so much so, let me tell you how serious the Pharisees were about the law. They had identified and documented 613 commandments in the law, 248 positive commands, and 365 negative commands. They had that many documented. They were serious about the law. This was an ongoing conversation for them. And yet, there's a huge error in their question. They betrayed themselves because they asked the question, what is the greatest command? You see, they had actually divided the commands of God in a way that there were heavy or really, really, really important commands, and then there were other commands that weren't quite as important. Some received a great deal of weight, others not as much weight. Some greater attention, others not as much attention. But yet James, the brother of Jesus, says in James chapter 2, verse 10, that if your objective is to keep the law, then you are required to keep the whole law. He said, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point, he becomes guilty of all of it. So if you break one law, you are a lawbreaker. You're guilty of all of it. But their error didn't change the fact that the lawyer who asked Jesus this question was skilled in the law. He wasn't a novice. He wasn't a beginner. And I love Jesus' answer. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, with all your strength. By the way, there's a second commandment which is like that one. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus quoted Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which was part of what was known to them as the Shema. Let me explain this. It was a statement of faith that every Orthodox Jew would have quoted every day of their lives. They would either quote it when they woke up in the morning, or they would quote it at bedtime in the evening. It was this great statement of faith. The word Shema meant to hear. And so at the beginning of the phrase, the confession was, "Hear, O Israel." So that's how they would have started that confession. And then the person would quote Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, chapter 11, verses 13 through 21, and then Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 through 41. They would have done that every single day of their lives. And Jesus knew that. And so he used what was common to the Pharisee and what was acceptable to the Pharisee to answer his question. Did everybody get that? But Jesus, in his answer, challenged the Pharisees by pointing out that loving God isn't a confession you quote. It isn't a confession of faith that you recite, but loving God is a life you live. No one really loves God and sits on it. It's a call to action. Love leads to obedience. Do we realize that, church? And Jesus called them to obey. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And his answer would have been really bold to them. Let me tell you why. Because it would have been Jesus saying, you need to add this to the Shema. Not that you would just recite this confession of faith about loving God, but that you would go a step further and you would actually love people. Not that you would just love God, but that you would also love the people that he's created in his image. Go and do this. And in spite of his clear direction about what is most important, does it amaze anybody else how much religion has managed to make everything so complicated instead of just pointing to the main thing? Jesus gave a straightforward answer. Love God with all of your heart and love people in that same way. Every other law depends on this. As a matter of fact, Jesus' statement could be put in a picture. If you can imagine a door, and the door hangs on hinges. The door swings on hinges. The door depends on hinges. Jesus would say, the door is all of the law. The hinges, love God, love people. All of the law depends on that. It's the greatest commandment. And religion has complicated that with all kinds of expectations and rules and all kinds of things that have nothing to do with loving God and loving people. We've made add-ons to the great commandment. But we probably shouldn't worry about doing very much else until we learn to really love God and really learn to love people. And sadly, all too often, the add-ons distract from what Jesus actually said and what he actually taught. Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, what matters most. He said, owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law for the commandments. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. And any other commandment are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Jesus was so serious about love that he didn't make it a matter of convenience. He made it a commandment. Do you realize today that as Christians, we don't have a choice but to love people if we're going to follow Jesus? But what people? Like, can I sit down and make categories? Like, I will love these people if they believe like me, if they look like me, if they vote like me, if they, agree with my opinions, if I like them, if I'm drawn to them through a hobby or something. I mean, we start making all these lists and all these categories, and God would say no. Every single person on the planet is an image bearer of God. I didn't say every single person on the planet is a Christian. And I didn't even say every single person on the planet is a child of God. I hear believers say that all the time, and it's a huge mistake. We're all God's children. No. We're all God's creation. The Bible would say, to many as who believed him, To them gave he the power to become the children of God. There's a distinction. There's a difference in being the creation of God and being the children of God. But as a result of being the creation of God, we are made in the image of God. And because other people are equal image bearers of God, we are called, commanded by Jesus to love them regardless of how we feel about their personal lives or their decisions or their political persuasion or their color or anything else. We are called to love people in that way. And that's not Brian Edwards who said that. That's Jesus who said that. We're to love people. That is the fulfilling of the law. John chapter 15, verse 12. Jesus said, "This is my commandment, that you love one another." It's a commandment. And by the way, what kind of love is he expecting us to offer? I mean, is this like I love their soul, but I don't love them? Which is pretty much like, I'm not wishing they would go to hell, but I pretty much hate them. That's what that means. Is that what he's talking about? No, because he goes on to say, "As I have loved you." If you want to know what this love that you're to have for other people looks like, then carefully examine the love that I've had for you. Romans chapter 5, verse 8. He loves us in spite of our imperfections. How many of you understand all of us have imperfections? Like, you don't have to hang out with people very long to see what's wrong with them. Like, have you ever been around somebody and you met them and you're like, "Oh my gosh, this is going to be the perfect friend." Then you hang around them a little while and you're like, "Oh my gosh, they're not." And you know what they're thinking? "Oh my gosh, this is the perfect friend." Oh my gosh, they're not. They're thinking the same thing about you. Because we all have problems. The other day, Pastor Tommy over here made a joke about one of my natural inclinations. And he was right. I do exactly what he was joking about. He's been around me long enough to learn that. I mean, we've been all over the place together. For Pete's sake, we've spent 18 hours in the front seat of a van heading in one direction. We've been together so much. He knows these things about me. But guess what? I also know things about him. And love says, I'm going to love you anyway. Like, there's more about you that I love than I don't. And hopefully he feels that same way about me. Do you feel that same way about me? Thank you, chicken. I love you. I recently was in a conversation with a Greek and Hebrew scholar, which is a little intimidating. This guy has multiple doctorates in biblical language. And so you can literally bring out the Hebrew and he can read it better than I can read English. The same with the Greek. He's just amazing. And he referenced this verse, Romans 5:8, and he finally, for the first time, taught me what commended really means. He said, "Brian, have you ever been to a jewelry store?" "Yeah, of course." He said, "Have you ever walked by the jewelry cabinet and the diamond is on a black crushed velvet piece of fabric and the lighting is absolutely perfect so that the diamond gets maximum shine, maximum glisten, maximum attention?" Yeah. He said, that's what the word commended means. God wanted to put his love on display. He wanted to put his love on the crushed black velvet cloth under the best lighting so that it would shine the brightest. How did he do that? He loved us while we were sinners. And you missed a great chance right there. That's really good. That's not even my stuff. Like, you could have at least amened him. That's amazing. That God said, if you want to see how beautiful my love is, how glorious and how great my love is, When you were a sinner, I loved you. So much so that my son died for you. God loves us in spite of our imperfections. John chapter 15, verse 13. He loved us sacrificially. He gave his life for us on the cross. Not just part of his life, but all of his life. Not just some of his blood, but all of his blood. Not just some of his breath, but all of his breath. Romans chapter 8, verses 35 through 39. He loves us unconditionally. Nothing is ever going to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Isn't that a blessing? That's beyond an emotion. That's beyond a feeling. That's beyond, you're the reason in my life. You're the inspiration. It's beyond that. It's beyond that. It's not just an emotion that fulfills us. By the way, if you say you love only in hopes that you will be fulfilled, it took me a lot of years of marriage to learn this. You're not loving, you're manipulating. Love is, I'm going to be kind to you regardless. I'm going to sacrifice for you regardless. I'm going to be unconditional in my love regardless. Jesus said, I want you to love as I have loved. That's how he loved. It's John 3:16. It affirms that truth, that he so loved us that he gave his only son, his only begotten son. We would have never known the so love of God had God not been willing to give us his son. But it's through the gift of his son that we hear him say to the world, I love you this much. And so when we love beyond our limits, this is what we're saying. We love people and we show it. We love people and we show it. Several years ago, when Sydney, you hear me call her Doodle. She's always been Daddy's Doodle. She's 20 years old, and the other night she hugged me and she said, Daddy, am I still your Doodle? I said, always and forever, darling. Even after I'm gone, you'll always be Daddy's Doodle because you'll never have another daddy and you'll never be anybody else's Doodle. And by the way, she is serious about no one else calling her that. Even on occasion, her mom will say, Doodle. And she's like, that belongs to Daddy. But Sydney was 5, and I was mowing the grass, and she came outside while I was mowing the grass, and I came around the house and saw her, and she was standing there, and she had this big smile on her face. And when our eyes met, she pointed at herself, and then she pointed at me on the mower. She pointed back to herself, then she pointed at me on the mower. And I could read her lips, and she was saying, can I ride the mower with you? So I pressed the brake and turned off the blades and motioned for her to come to the front of the mower so I could pick her up and set her on the lawnmower with me. I think I realized, those moments weren't going to last forever, and they don't. And all the parents whose babies are grown now, you realize they only last, even my twin knows that, they only last for a moment. It's here and gone. And she wanted to ride the mower with me, and I wasn't going to miss that opportunity. So she got up in my lap, and we started mowing the grass, and man, we were singing Tomorrow to the top of our voices. The sun will come out tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar that tomorrow. I mean, we were doing the whole theatrics and everything, and we were laughing, and I was tickling her, and she was laughing, and She sat on my lap mowing the grass, I guess, for at least about an hour and a half. She didn't have any money. She didn't bring me anything expensive. She wasn't carrying a special trophy because of something she had achieved athletically, and she wasn't bringing a certificate because of anything that she had accomplished educationally. And she was giving me something much greater than that. She was showing me that she loved me. And there was no missing it. We played Simon Says, and my favorite part about that day was she would kiss me over and over and over again. I have no idea how many times she kissed me on the cheek while we were mowing the grass that day. And every little bit, she would say, "Okay, Daddy, this is going to be a long one." And she would press her little lips against my cheek as hard as she could. Now, let me ask you a question. I don't have money, and I'm resigned to the fact that I never will. Do you think you have enough money to buy that moment for me? Absolutely not. She was showing me that she loved me. My leg was numb. I mean, I couldn't feel anything from the waist down. I think it took me a few hours to start walking actually again when I got off the mower. It didn't matter. My mower was small, didn't matter. And that little act of love made a mark on my life, and Sydney's now 20. That's been 15 years. And here I am telling you about it. The only thing she gave me that day was the only thing she had to give. And it was loved. And I'm telling you, there are people all around us who are questioning, am I loved? Mental illness on the rise, suicide on the rise, depression, anxiety on the rise, loneliness on the rise. I think I mentioned this to you recently. You may hear me say it a few more times. For the first time ever in history, Britain has now created a government position called a minister of loneliness. Think about that. That people are so lonely, they've created a government position in an attempt to deal with loneliness. You know what people want to know? That they're loved. You know the only group on the planet that's been commanded to show that? Us. It's when we love beyond our limits that we really reveal Jesus. It's when we love beyond our limits that we really show people who He is. It's not just about loving the people in this room. It's about loving the people in this room in such a way that it equips us to love the people out there. Yeah, but what about this group of people? Love them. What about those people who are acting like that? Love them. Wait a minute, what about those people who look like? Love them. What about those people who believe? Love them. Church, we need to love beyond our limits. I heard a little while back the story of an incredibly rich man who lived his whole life to amass money, and he did that, and he did it well. He made his family live as if they had nothing. On the day that he died, his children hated him so much. It was the weekend. And they called the president of the local bank and demanded that he meet them at the bank and give them all of the money that he had on hand that he could give them that belonged to their dad. And they celebrated his death by going for the first time ever and spending his money. Now, there are people in this room. You have parents who've left you no money whatsoever. Jeannie, that beautiful post you put about your dad this past week was not because of any money he left you. It was because of the love that he left. Others of you know what it's like to have been impacted by people's love. That's what matters. Jesus would say, this is my commandment. And I don't want to alter his words at all, but love beyond your limits. Because that's what loving your neighbor requires. And that's the love that we've been called to. And Hope Church, that's one of the ways we will be able to help change the world. Let's stand, if you would, while they sing. And just know that Jesus has loved you. If you're in the room or you're watching online and you're not a Christian, he loved you enough that he gave himself for you. Just give your life to him today. If he's drawing you, give your life to him. Accept salvation. Jesus, I want to know you. I want to be saved. I want to be a believer. I want to follow you. And then Christians, we really need to talk about the lack of love that we share to the world. We need to talk to God about that. Most of the time we love in our little small circle, not beyond our limits. And Jesus has called us to more than that. As they sing.
The love of God is greater far than tongue or pen can ever tell. It goes beyond the highest star and reaches to the lowest hell. The guilty pair bow down with care. God gave his son to win.
Yes.
His erring child he reconciled and pardoned from his sin. Oh, love of God, how rich and pure, how measureless and strong, it shall forevermore endure. The saints and